What you're watching unfold in the Russian skies right now is not just an aviation story. It is a story about sovereignty, survival, and the stubborn refusal of a major world power to accept the terms that the Western financial and political establishment has tried to impose on it. And if you understand that, you understand something much bigger about the world we are living in right now. Tupolev recently presented its proposed long-range passenger jet, the Tu-454, at the 20th Russian Venture Forum in Kazan, marking an early-stage concept aimed at future wide-body development, a signal of Russia's renewed ambition to develop a domestically designed long-haul airliner that could eventually challenge the global wide-body segment dominated by Airbus and Boeing. Now, that might sound like a press release. It might sound like the kind of thing a government says to reassure its citizens that everything is going according to plan. But when you sit with it for a moment and look at what is actually happening around this announcement, the geopolitical shifts, the industrial realities, the decisions being made in boardrooms and government ministries not just in Moscow but in Beijing and New Delhi and beyond, you realize this is a signal worth paying very close attention to. Because here is the thing. Russia is in the middle of something that almost never happens in modern history. It is attempting to rebuild an entire industrial sector from scratch, under the pressure of the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a major economy, while simultaneously fighting a land war in Europe and restructuring its entire relationship with the global order. And against every prediction made by Western analysts and mainstream media commentators, it is not collapsing. It is adapting, slowly, painfully, with enormous cost and real setbacks, but adapting nonetheless. At the start of 2022, Russia operated between 1-500 and 1-800 Western-made aircraft. Think about that number for a second. The overwhelming majority of the planes carrying Russian passengers from Moscow to Vladivostok, from Novosibirsk to Sochi, were built by Boeing and Airbus. Around 75% of Russia's commercial air fleet were built in the United States, the European Union, or Canada. When the sanctions came down hard in early 2022, that meant Russia suddenly found itself flying an enormous fleet of aircraft for which it could no longer legally obtain spare parts, software updates, maintenance support, or insurance coverage from Western providers. The architects of those sanctions believed, and many of them said openly, that this would bring Russian aviation to its knees within months. That has not happened, but the pressure is absolutely real, and it is getting worse over time. Russian airlines reported more than 800 equipment malfunctions that led to flight cancellations or emergency landings from January through late November 2025, roughly 4 times the number recorded during the same period in 2024, when just over 200 such cases were logged. That is not a statistic you can wave away. That is a system under compounding stress, and it tells you something important. The shadow networks, the cannibalized spare parts taken from grounded aircraft, the gray market components smuggled through third countries. Gray market parts may lack proper certification, and cannibalized components have a limited remaining lifespan. None of those workarounds are sustainable. They are buying time, and everyone in Moscow knows it. The clock is ticking, and the only real answer is to build new planes, domestically, using components that no Western government can cut off with the stroke of a pen. That is the context in which you have to understand the Tu-454, the MC-21-500, and the entire restructuring of Russian civil aviation that is now underway. This is not an academic exercise. This is a national survival strategy dressed up in engineering blueprints. Let's talk about what Russia is actually working with right now. The immediate workhorse of this industrial revival is the Tupolev Tu-214. In November 2024, testing of an updated Tu-214 with import-substituted components began, and in December 2025, Rosaviatsia approved the modifications to the Tu-214, which focused on the replacement of foreign systems with domestic Russian ones. Changes that included a new electronic flight instrument system, weather radar, ground proximity warning system, and traffic collision avoidance system. Those 17 systems that used to come from Western suppliers, including components manufactured by Honeywell, are now being replaced with Russian equivalents. 8 Tupolev Tu-214 planes will be built in 2026, followed by 12 in 2027, and then from 2028 production will rise to 20 a year. Now some people look at those numbers and laugh. 20 aircraft a year. Boeing delivers more than that in a week on a slow month. And that critique is not entirely wrong. Factories were expected to produce 5 civilian aircraft in 2023, 40 in 2024, and 82 in 2025. But in reality, only 13 new aircraft were added between 2022 and 2025, 12 Sukhoi Superjets and 1 Tu-215. The gap between ambition and reality in Russian aviation production has been staggering. Every honest observer has to acknowledge that. The missed deadlines are not spin, they reflect genuine industrial difficulty. But here is where the analysis that comes out of Western think tanks and aviation trade publications tends to go wrong. They measure Russia's progress against the standard of Western aerospace production and declare failure because Russia has not matched it. That is not the right comparison. The right question is this: is Russia moving in a direction that allows it to function independently of Western supply chains? And increasingly, the answer to that question is yes, not quickly enough to prevent real pain in the short term, but directionally, unmistakably, yes. The Tu-454 program has become a cornerstone of Russia's short-term aviation strategy, and in February 2026, the S7 Group signed a memorandum of cooperation to order 100 Tu-414 aircraft, signaling renewed confidence in domestic production. A major Russian private airline group placing a memorandum for 100 domestically built aircraft is not a trivial data point. That is the Russian private sector beginning to align itself with the reality that the era of leasing Boeing and Airbus jets is over, and the future of Russian aviation will be built in Kazan and Irkutsk, not in Seattle and Toulouse. Now let's talk about the MC-21, because this is the aircraft that represents Russia's real ambition in the narrow-body segment, the category that dominates commercial aviation worldwide. The first MC-21 airliner, made of only Russian-produced components, finally took flight on April 23, 2025, when tail number 73255 soared skyward from the Irkutsk aviation plant. That flight was genuinely historic. Whatever you think about Russian politics, whatever you think about the war, the engineering achievement of taking a modern, narrow-body aircraft that was originally designed with Pratt and Whitney engines and a supply chain that ran through American, European, and Japanese suppliers, and then rebuilding it from scratch using entirely domestic components. That is a serious industrial feat. The aircraft received 5th-generation PD-14 aircraft engines, which have already been certified and are being mass-produced, along with a domestic auxiliary power unit, air conditioning and pressure control systems, lighting equipment, and aircraft system consoles. But the honest picture also includes the difficulties. In March 2024, Kommersant reported that the MC-21 was currently overweight by 5.75 metric tons, rendering it incapable of meeting its original specifications for operating weight, range, and altitude. By October 2025, the new MC-21-310 had made its first flight, but 5 key foreign components still had not been replaced: the ice protection system, vacuum toilet system, collision avoidance system, weather radar, and power supply. Certification is now pushed back to the end of 2026, with production realistically no earlier than 2027. And even beyond the technical challenges, the PD-14 engines cost around double that of the superior Pratt and Whitney engines they are replacing. The economics of Russian domestic aircraft production are brutal right now. What this means is that the Tu-214 and the MC-21 are not exactly clean replacements for the 2.5-century-old tradition of efficient Western commercial aviation. They are more expensive to operate, they carry technical compromises forced by the constraints of indigenous production under sanctions, and they are arriving years later than promised. But here is the crucial insight: they are arriving, and the direction of travel matters as much as the current position. 2026 marks the definitive transition from Russia's maintenance phase to its manufacturing phase. By March 2026, the United Aircraft Corporation is reported to have approximately 20 MC-21 airframes at various stages of assembly in the Irkutsk aviation plant. That is not nothing. That is an industrial pipeline beginning to form, and the geopolitical implications of that pipeline extend far beyond Russian domestic aviation, which brings us to the Tu-454 and the MC-21-500. These are the programs that tell you where Russia is trying to go over the next decade, not where it is today. The Tu-454 concept is expected to align with Russia's future engine development roadmap, particularly the PD-26 turbofan program, which is being developed by United Engine Corporation as a high-thrust power plant intended for both civilian and military applications. The PD-26 is based on technology derived from the PD-35 program and incorporates modular core architecture along with advanced materials, including ceramic composites and enhanced thermal management systems. A wide-body aircraft with a domestically developed high-thrust engine capable of competing, at least on paper, with the Boeing 787 Dreamliner and the Airbus A350. Industry commentary cited by Russian aviation outlets suggests the Tu-454 is being positioned conceptually as a competitor to those aircraft, although this positioning has not been formally confirmed by Tupolev. And for the MC-21-500, the prospective Russian MC-21-500 airliner with a capacity of 270 passengers will fly with the new PD-26 aircraft engines. Some of the MC-21-500 units need to be created from scratch, in particular the wing, center section, and other components. So Russia is essentially planning to stretch and upgrade its primary narrow-body platform to compete not just with the A320neo family, but to push into the territory currently occupied by aircraft like the A321XLR, the high-capacity, long-range single-aisle segment that is probably the most commercially valuable space in commercial aviation right now. Now think about where the CR929 fits into this picture, or rather, where it no longer fits. The program was previously developed by Kraik, a joint venture between Comac and the Russian United Aircraft Corporation. In 2023, following tensions between the partners and uncertainties associated with the international sanctions on Russia, Comac continued the program independently of UAC. Russia essentially lost its seat at the table on what was supposed to be the flagship Sino-Russian aerospace collaboration of the 21st century. UAC CEO Yuri Slyusar confirmed that UAC is no longer a partner in the CR929 joint venture, although Russia still hopes to remain involved as a normal supplier and builder of the composite wing, PD-35 engines, and other subsystems. China, watching Russia's industrial difficulties compound under the weight of sanctions, made a pragmatic calculation. Carrying a sanctioned partner makes the program more complicated, and China does not need that complication. The name change from CR929 to C929 reflects that the aircraft is now being independently developed by China. That is a significant geopolitical moment that received almost no coverage in the American mainstream press. Russia and China have been presented for years by Western analysts as an unbreakable axis. The narrative has been that sanctions on Russia only push Moscow closer to Beijing, and that Beijing will fill every gap that the West creates. And while there is truth in that general direction, the C929 story shows that the relationship is more transactional than ideological, and that China will not sacrifice its own industrial ambitions to accommodate Russian limitations. China and Russia are not allies in the same way that, say, the United States and the United Kingdom are allies. They are strategic partners of convenience, and when the convenience runs thin, Beijing will make choices that serve Beijing. This is important context for understanding why the Tu-454 matters beyond just its role as a domestic aviation solution for Russia. If Russia is locked out of the Sino-Russian widebody project, and if Russia's airlines are bleeding flights and safety incidents as their Western fleet ages out, then Russia's long-term aviation future has to be built entirely on its own industrial base. The Tu-454 is not just a commercial aircraft concept, it is a statement of intent. Russia will develop the full stack of commercial aviation capability, from regional jets to wide-body long-haul aircraft, independently of any foreign partner. Russia's geography and the loss of access to Boeing and Airbus jets have increased pressure to develop indigenous solutions. For now, the Tu-454 stands as an early-stage concept that outlines intent rather than a defined program. That distinction, intent versus defined program, is honest and important. Russia's domestic aviation sector has struggled to meet production targets even for smaller aircraft. Programs such as the Tu-414 have delivered only limited numbers, while new aircraft such as the MC-21, SJ-100, and Il-114-300 are still awaiting certification. Announcing a wide-body concept while you are still struggling to deliver 8 narrow-body jets a year is, to put it diplomatically, ambitious. But ambition and strategic vision are not the same as delusion, and Russia has historically demonstrated the capacity for exactly this kind of long-horizon industrial planning. Imperfectly executed, chronically delayed, but eventually delivered. What this all adds up to, if you step back far enough to see the whole picture, is a fundamental restructuring of the global aerospace order. For 70 years, commercial aviation has been a domain of Western industrial dominance. Boeing and Airbus have shared the market between themselves so completely that the idea of a third major commercial aircraft manufacturer entering the field has seemed almost impossible. But the combination of Russian industrial necessity, Chinese state ambition, and the growing desire of countries in the global south to find alternatives to Western-controlled supply chains is creating the conditions for exactly that disruption. In early 2026, the UAC showcased the fully import-substituted SJ-100 at the Wings India Air Show, presenting the aircraft in an Indian-themed livery and signing localized production agreements with Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. pushing Russia's sanction-proof aviation model as a viable export product for other nations wary of Western supply chain cutoffs. That detail is enormously revealing. Russia is not just trying to replace its domestic fleet, it is actively marketing its sanction-proof aviation model to other countries. And there are a lot of countries in the world right now that have watched what happened to Russia's aviation sector and drawn the conclusion that dependence on Western aerospace supply chains is a strategic liability. If Washington can cut Russia off from aircraft parts, it can do the same to any country that finds itself on the wrong side of American foreign policy. That lesson has been absorbed. The Tu-454 concept, the MC-21-500 development program, and the broader Russian aviation industrial revival are therefore not just stories about Russia. They are early indicators of a shift in the global power structure that goes far beyond aviation. They tell us that the era of unchallenged Western industrial supremacy in high-technology sectors is beginning to fracture, not collapsing overnight, not ending cleanly or quickly, but fracturing, the way ice fractures before it breaks. The sanctions that were supposed to prevent Russia from building advanced aircraft have instead created the conditions under which Russia has no choice but to master the entire technology stack from first principles, and in doing so, is potentially creating an export capability that will compete in markets that Boeing and Airbus have taken for granted for decades. That is the real story behind the Tu-454 and the MC-21-500. Not whether these aircraft will be ready on schedule, not whether they will match the fuel efficiency of the 787. The real story is the direction of travel, the strategic logic, and the global implications of a world where Western industrial choke points are no longer as unchallengeable as they appeared to be in 2019. We are living through one of those rare periods when the map of global power is being redrawn, and the flight plans coming out of Kazan and Irkutsk are part of that redrawing, whether the editorial boards of the New York Times and the Washington Post choose to notice it or not.